This week we're learning about shade and shadow. One of the first exercises you'll do is study a piece of crumpled paper, and then after you draw the shape and the contour lines of the crumpled paper, you're going to add shading using the techniques that we practiced last week with cross-hatching. You can also layer on some watercolor as well. So feel free to experiment with the crumpled paper to develop your style of adding shade and shadow. Now, if we're talking about shade and shadow, we also have to talk about highlights. So highlights are where the light is most visible, and in a way it might wash out some of the colors. So I'm going to try to point out the highlights here. See how bright the white is here on the paper, and I can also guess because I've got my light source set up on this side of the sheet, and so I will assume that the highlight will be on that side generally, and then the shadowing and the shading will be on the opposite side of where the light source is. So if my light source is coming from here, my shade and shadow will be on this side and projected from this side, which is true in this case. You can see very clearly. So set it up when you do your crumpled paper in a similar way where you've got a single light source shining on your crumpled paper. So we've identified the brightest areas, and sometimes when you're out on site it may be a little bit harder to find where those highlights are. It could be helpful to sort of squint your eyes. The main thing, you want to look past the colors. For this, it's really easy because there are no colors, but when you're somewhere out and maybe there's a dark brown portion of a building because of brick or something like that, maybe that portion is actually still in highlight, even though the color makes it look darker. So make sure that you're looking past the color, and that's where that trick of squinting might help you remove some of the biases you have and really just try to look at, okay, where are the dark areas, where are the light areas. Now, adding shade and shadow highlights, it's going to quickly add depth to your drawing. So say that you only have a certain amount of time on a sketch and you finish the ink part of it, but you want to add just a little something extra, focusing on the contrast, the black and the white, the shade and the shadow, the values, that will give you the quickest results to adding depth and some realistic quality to your drawing. For contrast, even just identifying where your darkest areas are, like for instance here, so this kind of ridge right along here is one of the darker areas, and then of course on this side as well we've got a really dark area, and then in between there's all kinds of midtones, right? So this is not quite as bright. Again, you're always having a reference point. It's not quite as bright, but it's definitely not as dark as this one, so it's a mid-tone, but then over here you've got an even darker mid-tone. So there's a full range that you want to start to pick up on with your eye and notice the subtleties, and then bring those subtleties to your sketch as well. So what I was saying is the really fastest ways to identify where are my darkest areas. So for here, maybe the shadow, and then there's a few spots that are the darkest. Maybe focusing on that first, where you get those really dark areas, in contrast with the highlight, because if you draw in these dark areas with black, you're automatically also showing where highlights are, because it's assumed that the rest is in highlight. So you kind of get a double purpose there of making sure you're representing those really dark areas. There's some good examples in the book too, so look at the reference images that I have from both of the books, and that'll help you see how just adding that contrast will be really important. Okay, so let's get started here. You can see in my sketch it's just looks like a jumble of lines really until you start adding the shade and shadow. So when you're cross-hatching, you kind of want to pick a method and stick with it. So if I decide that I'm going to start with hatching in this diagonal direction, so something like this, and then of course the darker I want my hatching to be, the closer my lines will be together. Start with this and kind of stick to it. You could also introduce cross-hatching in the other direction. That will help darken some of the areas. But notice that I will pick one and stick with it. Now if you want to experiment with the scribbles, you know, then do that, where you just scribble in the dark, and then stick with that method. For this, I would choose to go with just a simple cross-hatching. That's what I'm going to do. You can pick whatever method you want, but just make sure you're sticking with it. And my paper's moved slightly, so it may not look exactly right, but I think we've got enough to go on here. So I see a dark area here, so I'm just going to do that crosshatch. I'm picking the area that I think is the darkest area, and I'm going to start there so that I get the biggest impact, even if I don't have time to finish. So remember, part of our learning here is time management. So I see a darker spot, so I'm going to add some extra hatching there. I also think that there's a really dark area here and here. Oops. So I'm going to go ahead and hatch that. So you kind of pick away a method, a technique. Notice that my lines are very solid as usual. Again, I'm going to go back with that cross-hatching to really get that darker tone that I'm going for, that darker value. Okay, for time's sake, I'm going to stop there. So that, let's see, there's a little, yeah, we'll stick with that. I'm calling these my darkest area. There's another dark area here that I would say match. So you're looking for matching values within your subject. So I see this value, and this value as being about the same. And then the shadow too. You want to remember the shadow because the shadow helps ground the object or the architecture that you're looking at. It gives it a setting. And usually the shadow is going to be one of your darker values as well. The shape of that's a little more like that. And then over here as well. Okay, so of course I could go on and I could do more. I could do the mid values. But for now, it's all along this edge. I'll finish out this shadow and then I'm going to move to watercolor. But see how even within my shadow, by adding that second layer of cross-hatching, I'm starting to get a fade effect here. It's really dark along the edge, and I can even go back and add another layer of lines that are closer together. So you want to make sure you have that black to white range. So you're trying to get a full black color at your darkest areas. Like that, and then you'll add in the midtones that are spaced out a little more, right? So the goal is to get that full range. Okay, so you would work through the rest of this with pen, but for watercolor, I'm going to show you some techniques with that, because what's unique with the watercolor is that you are leaving the highlights as the white of your paper, but you can add subtle changes next to it. Okay, so here is a very light gray color. Now remember, the other thing with watercolors, you have to let it dry. Before you add more layers around, let it dry. So again, I'm looking for other mid-tones similar to this, and then I can go ahead and add those in. And you can layer with the watercolor. Once it's dry, I can go back, layer more mid-tones in. But notice where I find the most highlight, I'm going to leave completely white. So here, I'm looking at the paper, here in this area, those are the brightest. So I'm going to leave those white, but everything else should have a slight value to them, so you can make it a bit of a wash on all the areas that aren't those really bright highlight areas, and then come back and layer more. Now of course you're welcome to layer watercolor and the ink. I think that makes for an interesting composition as well. But you may get to a point where you're like, all right, I need to let it dry and then come back and add more. But to really get that contrast, you have to identify those colors of high value. Also remember, you can always come back with paper towel, and say you added too much, you can just tap, tap, tap to lift up some of the color.